Hey, good morning, Community Church.
Good morning.
Hey, my name is David. I've been married to my wife Amanda for almost 9 years. We have 4 kids, ages 6 months to 6 years old. So if you're looking at me and you're like, this guy looks tired, I promise you, I got plenty of sleep last night. This is just my face now. So I'm the Connections pastor at Victory Christian Church in Franklin, Indiana. I do groups. We do volunteers, new member stuff. It's a great time. I'm so excited to be with y'all here for these next couple weeks. As John said, I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. When I got all the information about the church and how to prepare for these few weeks, the dress code was in there and it said I had to wear shoes. So I'm wearing shoes today. It's a little uncomfortable and unnatural for me, but we'll see if we can get through it. Growing up, I had a summer job in Louisville that I kept all through high school and college. It was an awesome job. I was a cart boy at a country club, at a golf course. And basically, I just worked around golf. I would clean golf clubs. We would clean the golf carts. And if y'all have ever been to the driving range or Top Golf and you see the poor soul out there in that cage driving around picking up the balls that you always try to hit, I know you're trying to do that. That was me in my summer job. But in order to close every night for this job, before we had clocked out, we had to make sure all 75 golf carts were back in the cart barn. Can't leave until they're all in there, cleaned out, plugged in, ready to go for the next morning. I remember being short-staffed one night. It was just my buddy Gary and I, and Gary is still one of my closest friends, but we were swamped that night, just me and him. There was a major event going on, and all the golf carts were out on the course. Something going on at the clubhouse too, so nobody brought them back however they were supposed to. So Gary and I spent the whole night just running 100 yards up this hill, get a golf cart, bring it back, clean it, restock it, plug it in, rinse and repeat, back up this hill. All 75 golf carts we had to run up the hill and get. I forgot what it was that I had planned that evening as a high school kid in Kentucky. I'm sure it was something riveting. I'm sure it was very wholesome, something I had to get to. But we were just tired of being at work. We were getting a little impatient. So finally, my buddy Gary, he gets this bright idea. He gets this idea how we can get out of here faster. So he goes up and he gets 2 golf carts at one time. He sort of one arm over here, one on each steering wheel, spread, as far as you can, stretching out, drive 2 golf carts at one time. This ended exactly how you're thinking this ended in your mind. It did not go well. Gary very quickly lost control of one of the golf carts. Remember, we're up on this hill, so it just starts flying. I mean, this golf cart isn't going to stop until it hits another object. So we're just kind of bracing, just wondering what this thing is going to run into. Well, in the line of fire was the starter's bench, which is like this black wrought iron bench that sits there next to the first tee right there. And this golf cart was in a direct beeline for the starter's bench. Well, it met it at a high speed. I mean, it was an explosion. This bench was mangled. The grass was all torn up everywhere around it. This was a big collision. We looked around, as high school kids would do. Who saw that? Did anybody? Are we in the clear? What just happened? There was one man over there on the putting greens under the lights. It's dark. Why are you out here putting? But old man Mr. Crawford was out there putting. And we knew that his hearing was a little suspect just from our interactions with him, over the summers. But Mr. Crawford didn't hear a bomb went off behind him, and the man did not flinch. He was still over there putting. So we went back to the starter's bench. We put it back. We tried to replace some of the grass. It still looked terrible. But Gary and I left that night, and we came back the next morning to open. And Gary and I were not the first people there. 2 local police officers, the golf course superintendent were standing right there at the scene of the crime. And we walked up to him, and this is the part in the story where you're like, okay, all right, this future pastor, he's going to own up to his mistakes. This is the part where he confesses to the crime and everything is made right. If I told the story like that, it wouldn't be truthful. My congregation wouldn't buy it. Maybe you would because you just met me, but part of the reason I'm here is to fill in for Seth a little bit while he's gone. The other part is to make you feel better about Seth, to be more grateful that you were led by an honorable person. This was before me or Gary knew Christ, okay? So we walk up to the scene, and the police officers, the superintendent, they look at us, they look at the scene, they look back at us. Who's going to speak first? So the superintendent finally said, I just know it was those neighborhood kids again. It had to be those neighborhood kids. To which me and Gary replied, yeah, it had to be. It was surely them. It had to be. Today we're kicking off, as part of your mixtape summer, a little mini series the next few weeks titled The Unlikely. In this series, we're not looking at unlikely teenage criminals. We're looking at the unlikely people, the unlikely men and women whom God would call to do amazing things on his behalf. Since God created humans, God has done so much through his creation, through humans, to bring hope, to restore, to bring peace, to send message, to be a light in a dark place, to rescue, to heal. So many times, time and time again, God has used men and women. So let me ask you, this is our first question for this morning. What kinds of people does God partner with? When you picture in your mind who it is, these men and women who God would use to do great things, who are they? What kinds of people does God partner with? Are they the super spiritual kind? The really religious people, that's who God uses. Maybe people with lots of wealth, is that it? Maybe it's the strong, tough alpha males that God uses. Or maybe the super charming, charismatic, winsome speakers. Is that who God targets? The popular kids, the people of means and influence, who's God using? What kinds of people does God partner with? This question is going to kind of lead us through this mini series. It'll be the crux of what we talk about. And we're going to actually work through the book of Judges. We're going to take inventory on the types of people who God uses. And we'll note what kind of traits they have, their history, their background, even sometimes their physical attributes. We just want to learn, how does God advance his kingdom in the world? What kind of people does God use? And what is our own role in that? So I know Pastor John taught last Sunday from John's gospel, and I think before that, y'all were talking a lot about Moses for a few weeks, so that's actually going to be a perfect segue for where we're going to go together. First, let's talk about this document that will be in the book of Judges. What's going on here? This is an Old Testament book that records history in about a 350-year period, from about 1,000 to about 1,300 years before Jesus. But probably the most defining characteristic of this book of Judges, there is this unmistakable, repeatable, consistent pattern through the book of Judges, over and over again, this cycle. It's clear and distinct, and actually part of it can be summed up in just one verse. I think it's chapter 21, verse 25. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. My mind first goes to back in junior high when the teacher would leave the room for several minutes and just the classroom by themselves. In a total circus, it would be absolute chaos in there. I mean, there was everybody did what was right in their own eyes or whatever they felt like doing. The moment the teacher comes back in, wow, you all have been so good. It's so quiet in here. Everyone was doing whatever they wanted to do because there was no tangible beacon of morality. There's nobody to follow or to guide. So essentially, we become in those moments enslaved by our own desires. We in a way sort of assert ourselves as king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Here's maybe a more complete way to look at this cycle that we see in Judges. It always starts like this. Israel commits some sin. They're essentially saying to God, hey, not going your way. I'm going to live life how I want to do. Israel commits some kind of sin. And then the next thing that happens is God says, okay, I'm going to let you go. If that is your wish, I will let you go. I've given you this free will. And God sort of removes his protective hand and allows Israel to be oppressed because they are making their lives look like their enemies. So God says, okay, I'll just turn you over to them. And then after a while, they're suffering. They're oppressed by these people. And Israel repents. They say, God, you were right. We're doing it wrong. They want to turn around, reorient our lives toward you. God, please save us. Draw us out of our suffering. And God, faithful God, answers in Judges, and he provides a deliverer. God sends someone there to draw them out from their oppression. And after a while of God's faithfulness, then the people in turn turn their hearts and they're faithful to God while the judge lives. And what's so interesting about this cycle is when we reflect on this, when we look at this honestly, this can be some seasons of our own life. I see some patterns here that look recognizable from times in my own life. Maybe times and seasons where you ran away from authority figures, where you did what you knew wasn't right, where we chose to be our own authority figure in our lives. Maybe we disobeyed our parents, or we went against our conscience. We chose our own desires and we went against God's will. And what happens was, a result, many times, suffering is on the other end of that. Pain is on the other end of that when we make ourselves our own ruler in our lives. And we feel the repercussions of that. We sit in our pain and then we cry back out to God. God, we know you're the only one that can deliver us from this. Lord, I'm tired of living my way. I'm finally ready, God, for you to take this thing over, to save me from myself. And God does so often. And he might use different means to reach us in different seasons, but maybe it's a friend or family member. Maybe it's a spiritual mentor. Maybe it's your community group here at church. However God chooses, he makes a way for us. He draws us out of this mess that we've made, and we're good again, aren't we? For a time. For a time. This is a tragic and still hopeful pattern that we see in Judges. And I'd like to kick off our series focusing on the first unlikely judge that we'll look at together. And that judge is Deborah. Deborah, there are actually two female heroes in this story, or heroines, and we'll begin by looking at Deborah. So, Judges chapter 4, if you want to follow along. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, now that Ehud was dead. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim. Okay, if you're overwhelmed by the proper nouns, hang tight for a second. There's only a couple that I really want you to lock in. Israel, their foe here, their enemy is Canaan. The Canaanites are oppressing Israel. And there's two names. Jabin is the king of Canaan, so remember Jabin. And then Sisera, these guys on the same team, Canaan. Sisera is the army general, so to speak. Canaan the king, Sisera leads the army, and they were a thorn in Israel's side. They were the oppressors here in this story. And when God told Israel to drive out Canaan, they didn't wipe them totally out. They actually kind of let folks hang around. And when they didn't fully obey God, well, they started to, over time, look a little bit more like the Canaanites, not like the people God had called them to be. And so a conflict eventually arises, and this King Jabin spends this next season here just terrorizing. We're going to learn it's a long time, actually, raining terror on God's people. And part of the reason they were able to inflict such terror is because of Sisera, great military figure here, great leader of the army. And one other major reason why Israel could not escape under the thumb of Canaan, and that's because they had this deadly, revolutionary piece of wartime technology that they would use that no one really else had, and that can be seen in verse 3. Because Sisera had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried out to the Lord for help. So look, we're just in verse 3 here, and you can already see half of that cycle that we see in Judges. God allows Israel to be oppressed because of their repeated and habitual sin, their unrepentant heart. God says, okay, allows Canaan to oppress them. Israel eventually cries out. After 20 years, God, please, we're doing this the wrong way. Send a deliverer. And it's hard to explain just how significant these chariots were. At the time, there was nothing else like it. Other nations may have had some form of transportation, even chariots, but I believe they were made of bronze. Canaan was 900 of them and made of iron. They were essentially unstoppable, pulled by horses so they could go long distance and essentially impenetrable. What are the Israelites going to do? How could you defeat an enemy like this? Well, you really can't until God sends a deliverer. Someone enters the scene. We see in verse 4. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. Anybody in here actually remember Lapidoth? He's not mentioned a lot in the Bible. Nobody, I hope, names your kid Lapidoth. We all know some Deborahs, though, don't we? We all know some Deborahs. This is somebody who's worth being named after. This is a person who impacted history. And yes, in this unlikely series, Part of her unlikeliness is her gender as a woman. There were so many cultural limitations for women back then, too many to count. But here's what you should know. It's kind of a side note. God doesn't subscribe to man-made cultural phenomena. God doesn't have to operate within those bounds. God called a ton of women through history to groundbreaking and revolutionary and incredible things. Some folks want to call the Bible antiquated and out of touch and old-fashioned and all this stuff. They either haven't read it or they're just plain wrong. One of the areas where it can't even be argued is that time and time and time again, God would raise up. What would emerge would be a public, visible female leader who made immeasurable contributions many, many times. You just talked about Moses. Who's Moses without Miriam? Hannah gave her only son Samuel to be raised in the temple, and look what he became. Esther's faithfulness led her to become a Jewish queen in a Gentile nation. Jesus' mother Mary literally raised the Son of God. Priscilla and her husband, who had huge impacts on the apostolic church. Lydia was a well-known businesswoman in town who helped fund Paul's ministry. Lois and Eunice raised Timothy when we don't think his father was even present. Who were the first people to find Jesus' empty tomb? It was women. The Christian faith is one that has consistently elevated the status of women. And so while Deborah might be an unlikely hero or heroine today in this story, it's more because of her time and place in history, not because God didn't use women. We see that he did time and time again. And right here it says she was the leader of Israel. Picking up in verse 6, it says that Deborah sent for Barak, son of Abinoam from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, Barak, the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you. This is what he says. He says, go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them up to Mount Tabor. Continuing on, I will lead Sisera, Deborah says. I'll lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots, those 900 iron chariots, and his troops to the Kishon River and give him into your hands. This is what Deborah is telling Barak. So God hears the cries of his people, and he is now going to intervene. It is time for God to send them a way out from their enemies, the Canaanites. God's going to use Barak to round up 10,000 men who are going to take them into battle. And then all the while, Deborah is going to draw out Sisera and bring them to the correct place. It's a done deal. I mean, here's the most important part of this little passage. God is going to give them into your hands. The battle's already won here. Deborah knows that. She's telling Barak, hey, we can take this to the bank. You can count on this. God has got this. It's going to come to pass. But Barak, it's not quite enough. Barak has some stipulations. He's got some things he wants to add into this deal. Barak said to Deborah, hey, if you go with me, I will go. But Deborah, if you don't go with me, I'm not going. I'm not going, Barak says, unless you go with me. And what we see here, Barak, this mighty warrior, his name means lightning. He's got this guarantee from God that this is God's battle. His army will prevail. They are going to rout the Canaanites. He's got this guarantee, but it's not quite enough for him. Barak wants a little bit more. He starts to negotiate with God. And in doing this, Barak will soon be humbled. He'll soon be humbled. In verse 9 says, certainly I'll go with you, said Deborah to Barak. But because of the course you're taking, Barak, the honor will not be yours. For the Lord God will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. Picture this. We're going to go back in time for a moment. It's 1954 in Louisville, okay? Not too far south from here. There was a 12-year-old kid in 1954 who was fuming angry. And this kid was so mad. Someone in the neighborhood stole his bicycle. And a police officer comes by, and the young 12-year-old boy says to the police officer, when I find out who stole my bike, I'm going to whoop him. And the police officer said, well, son, you better learn how to box then. That 12-year-old kid met with a trainer, and he never did find the person who stole his bicycle, but 6 years later, he won a gold medal in the Olympics in Rome for boxing. This was Muhammad Ali, and many people remember him for his swagger. Ali was a bad, bad man, and he knew it, He knew it and he talked about it all the time. He would be the first to tell you. Some famous Ali quotes, maybe you've heard. He said, if you even dream of beating me, you better wake up and apologize. Ali said, it's hard to be humble when you're great as I am. He also said, Sonny Liston is too ugly to be the champ. The world champ should be pretty, like me. Ali never won any awards for humility. But the champ was on a flight one time. Ali was on this flight. This is a true story, flying somewhere. And the pilot came on and said something like, ladies and gentlemen, I want to give you a warning. We're heading into a little bout of turbulence. So we've got some weather approaching. It's going to be a bumpy ride. Please fasten your seatbelts. Well, the flight attendant came around to make sure all the passengers were safe. Everybody was good. She saw Mr. Ali and she said, sir, we're coming into some turbulence. If you could please fasten your seatbelt. And Ali famously said to her, ma'am, Superman don't need no seatbelt. And the flight attendant quickly said to the champ, sir, Superman don't need no airplane. And today we remember Ali as a world heavyweight champion, one of the greatest athletes of all time, Sports Illustrated Athlete of the Century, arguably the greatest fighter the world had ever seen, Hall of Famer. But if you Google him, you know what's some of the first stuff to come up? His losses. His losses. He had 5 of them. And he had so many bad, poor, dishonorable excuses for every single loss. He couldn't take it well. He was humbled. This great warrior was humbled. Well, Barak, a great and mighty warrior, not in sport, but in real life, he ultimately is remembered in history and celebrated as a great warrior whom God used to do amazing things. Even in the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 11, we call this the Hall of Faith sometimes, of all these spiritual giants of the Old Testament. Guess who's in there? Well, we see in Hebrews 11 after this long list. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets. There he is, Barak, right next to giants like David and Samuel. Barak is listed there because God used these people to accomplish great things. But you know what? Barak was humbled in the process. He was brought down to earth. He showed weakness. And that part of Barak's story, that's going to be remembered too. Maybe even an asterisk by his name. Deborah pleaded for Barak to go into battle. God's already got this. And what did Barak say? Actually, I need you to go with me. I need more than that. You've got to come with me. And Deborah told him, you're going to be humbled by this. So Deborah does come with them, and Barak does round up 10,000 men to come to this fight. And here's where it sort of crescendos right here. Remember, Sisera's got 900 iron chariots. They come together in the valley, in the river valley of Kishon. And here's what we see starting in verse 14. Then Deborah said to Barak, go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you? So Barak went down to Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. Continuing. In Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword, and Sisera got down from his chariot and he fled on foot. We learn some of the details of this battle in the next chapter. They talk about it, but basically what happened was God brought this heavy, heavy downpour of rain. What happens in a river valley when it rains? It gets to be marshy. You can't even move in there. What would have especially difficult time moving would be these heavy 900 horse-drawn iron chariots. They were basically rendered useless there. They were designed not to move through marshy swamp. The Canaanite army was stuck and immobile right there in a vulnerable spot, and God's 10,000 men came down and it descended upon them. It's amazing how God uses sometimes the enemy's greatest weapon to defeat the enemy, isn't it? The thing I think of as the Roman cross, death in general used against the enemy. And God would use these iron chariots, the thing they thought they could never get past, to defeat this enemy. Verse 16 says, Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all Sisera's troops fell by the sword. Not a single man was left. Did Barak negotiate with God? He did. He did. Did he do exactly as he was called to do? No, he didn't. He didn't act in full and complete faith. And Barak isn't the main hero in this story, but there's something that we cannot miss from his example. This is a point we have to really reflect on. God delights in our imperfect acts of obedience. God delights in our imperfect acts of obedience. We sometimes think that we have to do things one certain way. There's one right way to do it. And the moment fear or doubt creep in, God's not going to use me anymore. I'm too late. I should have done this a long time ago. But I got to tell you, the Bible that I'm reading, the Bible that you're reading, is full of stories of men and women who tripped and stumbled and delayed and were full of fear. And time again, we see a God who blesses it despite their imperfections. He took what they could muster up, and God made something beautiful and amazing of it. Even if they didn't do it, quote, the best way, God saw them there. He met them there, even when they initially didn't want to do it. I don't say this to enable anybody to keep dragging your feet, if that's you right now listening to this. This isn't a green light to just, I'm going to get to that someday. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that maybe you've given up too quickly on that thing that God has called you to. And maybe you thought, I didn't do it the first time. I didn't do it the right way. Today is your new opportunity. Today, maybe you wish you'd start sooner, but I see a God who honors our imperfect obedience, who meets us in it. He delights in our obedience. The importance is that we just move forward in faith, even if it doesn't look how we hoped it would. In verse 17 says, Sisera meanwhile fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there was an alliance between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the family of Heber the Kenite. So what's going on here? Again, lots of proper nouns. There was an alliance between the Canaanites, okay, the oppressors of Israel, and the Kenites. Now, that alliance, it was kind of like your Facebook relationship status in 2006. It's complicated. They had an alliance, but the Kenites also had deeper, stronger history with Israel. Okay, so there's kind of a tangled web there. So Sisera, his army got wiped out, remember, and he's the one guy who's fled the scene, and he's just trying to get to the nearest place. Jael, a Kenite. Okay, these are our friends, I think. And it's funny because he asked Jael to do a couple things for him. First, he asked, can I have some water? And instead, she brings him milk. And then the next thing Sisera asks is, hey, watch over this tent. Make sure nobody comes in here. You're going to soon learn that she doesn't do that either. This is the part in the story where I should issue a quick warning. I see there's families in here. The Bible's rated R sometimes. So we're going to read the text and see what happens next. It says, but Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer. Okay? So this guy's sleeping. Sisera's sleeping in this tent, thinks he's safe. And she went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. And she drove the tent peg through his temple into the ground. Jael coming in there. Sisera thinks he's safe. Jael says no. And here's my favorite part. He died. Okay, I'm glad we added that in there so we could understand what would happen. All of a sudden, this Bible story, is this a Bible story? This looks more like a questionable Netflix documentary. All of a sudden, this Bible story gets a little bit crazy. We knew it was going to be a woman who was going to do this. Deborah said it'll be at the hands of a woman. But all signs pointed to Deborah, right? Didn't you think it was going to be her? Meanwhile, here comes Jael, this faithful woman from a tribe that had a good history with Israel, and she knew who Sisera really was. She knew this man was evil, and at just the right time, she took aggressive action. She took a Louisville Slugger to both headlights. She fed Earl black-eyed peas. Whatever female violent ballad you want to hear when you see this scene, that's what Jael's doing. And this is the crescendo of this story. And you know, the thing about this is she probably hundreds of times had put that tent peg in the ground. Never would have dreamed that it would be used to thwart the enemy of God's people. But she had fulfilled what God had promised through Deborah earlier in the book. Sisera and the Canaanites, they're as good as gone, just like Deborah had said, and it was all done at the hands of a woman. So again, bringing it back here, what's the cycle we see in Judges? Israel commits sin, says, we're going to go about this our own way, God. We don't need you, effectively, is what they're saying. Well, God allows Israel to do that. He allows them to be oppressed by the Canaanites. They can't bear the suffering anymore. They call out to God. God, send a deliverer. God does in the form of Deborah. Could have been Barak. Sent Deborah and then Jael and delivers them from the Canaanites. Even Sisera is gone with a splitting headache. And then all of a sudden, Israel is faithful while the judge lives again. This is a wild story. Wow. Bold choice as a guest speaker to lead with a story like this. Yes, I realize that. But I think we can't leave it. We have to ask some important questions from this account. And the first one is, who am I here? And when I look at this story, who am I most like? Where are the strongest lessons for me? Maybe you feel like Deborah in this story. Are you Deborah, the natural-born leader, incredibly faithful, someone who tries to make other people shine, but will step in when necessary? Maybe you feel like Deborah. I certainly don't. I don't really relate to this person. She acts so swiftly. She's so confident. She's faithful. Definitive judgment from Deborah. Maybe you're more like Jael in this story. Somebody who isn't the center of attention, somebody who's kind of the unassuming person who God uses. Maybe that thing that you're doing every single day, hitting that nail, whatever it is, it might seem inconsequential for you, whether it's finance or healthcare or teaching or whatever it is God has gifted you with, encouragement, generosity. But someday, God is going to call on you to use that to push back the enemy, to advance the kingdom. Maybe you're Jael in this story. But honestly, for me, the most relatable person in this story is Barak. Do we have any Baraks here? And basically, I'm talking about seasons in life where you know God is calling you to do something and you want to follow. God, I believe I can do this. You think yourself. I think myself to be a great leader, but when push comes to shove and God calls on us to act, can you just show me a little more? God, can somebody else come with me? I want to do this. I do, but I just want to negotiate too, and I need something more from you. No matter who you consider yourself in this story, I think we just have to ask. It begs the question when we look at Barak's example is, in what ways am I still negotiating with God? If you're joining us this morning here or watching online, and you're on the outside of faith, the edges, still trying to figure out who this Jesus is, you're exempt. You don't have to wrestle with this question. Just keep tuning in. Just keep pursuing God. But if you've been to church before, if you call this your church home, if you're a believer, a follower of Christ, let's wrestle with this for a minute. In what ways am I still negotiating with God? I mean, have you ever followed God to a point? God, I'll come this far, but I don't know about that. God, you can have my attention on Sundays. Maybe I'll even join a community group. I'll serve for a while. But God, please don't touch my finances. God, I'll follow you to this point, but my career is my career. Whatever that is that you're kind of holding on to, I'll follow you to a point, God, but I don't want to forgive that person. What he did was so bad, God, I can't do it. So often our spiritual journey, we agree to live for Christ. We want to follow Jesus. It sounds so good to a certain point. And then when it gets risky or when it gets scary or when things get uncomfortable, we just say, God, I'm going to need more assurance here. I'm not so sure about this thing. And see, that's what Barak did. He was given this guarantee for how it would all end. I mean, he knew the ending of the story. Deborah told him that the Canaanites would be routed before him. But fear crept up in Barak, and his faith hit a wall to where he didn't feel like he could go any further in that moment. Even though God made this promise to him, Barak, he added more things to the contract. He had some addendums that he wanted God to look over before he would take another step. So our question is, in what ways am I negotiating with God still? We've seen his faithfulness in our lives, right? We've watched God work together improbable things around us for our good, in our family and our friends, prayers answered. God doesn't often work in the way maybe we think he would, but so many times if you recount him showing up, we know the ending too. Just like Barak, we know how this ends. That these few years we have in these finite bodies that are wasting away every day, that this is just part of the story, that the much greater story, the way that it ends, is when we unite our lives with Christ, when we accept the immeasurable grace that he's given us. That's not the ending of our story, that death would not be the end, that it would merely just be the door that we walk through when we unite our lives with Christ and we'd spend eternity with him. We know how this ends, that God is who he says he is, Jesus is who he says he is, and he'll do what he says he'll do. Whatever that thing is that you're holding on to right now, whatever that thing is that you're holding back from God, that you're gripping to tightly, more tightly than your heavenly Father, whatever that thing is, preventing you from giving God your whole self, whatever it is, my friend, I pray that today, that in these next few days, that through this series, you would just loosen your grip a little. Pray to God that he would allow you, give the courage and boldness to trust him, your good Father who's got a perfect track record, to just loosen your grip a little bit, to stop negotiating with God, to lay it all down at his feet, to trust him. And soon we will see that God will honor us in our imperfect, sometimes messy obedience. God will still show up there, and he'll often do things through us and in us that we never, ever would have thought possible. That's the God that we serve. Let's pray together. Father, I thank you for your perfect track record in our lives. God, I thank you for how you work together things for our good. God, I thank you for how you make a way when we look and all we see are roadblocks. God, you're constantly showing us just how faithful you are, how powerful you are. So my prayer, God, for each and every one of us is that the next time that we feel called, God, to use the gifts that you've given us, to seize an opportunity to be love in the world, that you would remove these barriers, that your voice would be the loudest. God, that we wouldn't let our fear make the decision for us, but that we would trust you, that you will show up, that the battle is yours the whole time, and that we merely just need to walk forward in obedience. God, I pray for that heart as we move forward this week, that we can continue to be light in a dark place. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.